Before we begin, take a second to get comfortable. If you enjoy slow, story-driven history that drifts through real lives instead of dry dates, make sure you're subscribed. And if anything in this story reminds you of something you still use today, leave a comment. Those comments genuinely shape what stories come next. Now imagine a medieval morning, long before alarm clocks, coffee makers, or even the idea that a product should actually work the way it's advertised. The sun rises not because you want it to, but because it has no choice. Somewhere in a damp stone house, a person wakes up cold, sore, and already tired, surrounded by objects that were supposed to make life easier, but somehow managed to do the opposite. This is the real starting point of our story, because medieval Europe was full of inventions that were announced with hope, sold with confidence, and then quietly failed in everyday use. And yet, strangely enough, many of those same ideas never truly disappeared. They limped forward through centuries, changed shape, and ended up on our shelves, in our homes, and sometimes even in our pockets today. In the Middle Ages, the idea of a product wasn't what it is now. There were no focus groups, no user testing, no safety regulations. Most products were built by craftsmen who learned through tradition, guesswork, and whatever materials happened to be available locally. If something failed, it didn't get recalled. People simply worked around it, complained about it, or accepted it as another inconvenience in a life already full of them. That acceptance is why so many failed medieval products survived. They didn't succeed because they were good. They survived because people had no better option. One of the clearest examples of this can be found in medieval footwear. Shoes were supposed to protect your feet from mud, cold, animal waste, and sharp stones. In practice, they often did none of those things very well. Early medieval shoes were typically thin leather, stitched together with minimal shaping, and designed more for speed of production than comfort. They absorbed water almost immediately. After a short walk in rain or snow, your feet would be soaked, numb, and blistered. The leather hardened as it dried, cracking and warping into shapes that no longer matched your foot at all. These shoes failed at their most basic job, yet the design survived for centuries. Why? Because making better shoes required better tanning methods, more leather, and more time, all of which meant higher costs. Most people simply couldn't afford improvement. So instead of fixing the shoe, people adapted themselves. They stuffed straw or rags inside for warmth. They walked differently to reduce pain. They accepted foot problems as normal. Even today, when we buy cheap mass-produced shoes that fall apart after a few months, we're echoing the same medieval logic. The product fails, but the system around it continues. Another everyday medieval failure sat right in the kitchen: early cookware. Pots and pans were heavy, uneven, and unpredictable. Cast iron was rare and expensive. Most cooking vessels were made of clay, bronze, or thin iron sheets riveted together. These cracked under heat, leached metals into food, and sometimes shattered without warning. A single mistake in temperature could ruin a meal or injure the cook. Yet these vessels were used daily, not because they worked well, but because cooking over open fire left few alternatives. Medieval cooks learned to read their cookware like a language. They listened for changes in sound as metal heated. They watched the color of clay to guess when it might crack. Recipes weren't written with exact measurements because the tools couldn't handle precision anyway. This failure shaped how people cooked, not just what they cooked. Even modern cookware marketing still leans heavily on medieval lessons. Even heat distribution, crack resistance, safety coatings. Every new kitchen innovation is quietly correcting a problem medieval people already knew too well. If you're finding this interesting so far, tap the like button. It helps this kind of long, quiet history reach people who need something calm to listen to. Lighting is another perfect example of medieval failure that refused to disappear. Candles and oil lamps were unreliable, smoky, and dangerous. Most medieval candles were made from tallow, rendered animal fat that smelled unpleasant and burned unevenly. They dripped constantly, coating surfaces with grease. Oil lamps weren't much better. They required constant trimming and refilling, and spilled oil could turn a wooden house into a fire trap in minutes. These lighting products failed in safety, efficiency, and comfort, but they endured because darkness was worse. People accepted soot-covered walls and irritated lungs because light meant productivity, prayer, and social life after sunset. The modern descendants of these failures are still with us. We still worry about indoor air quality. We still design lighting around fire risk, heat output, and energy waste. The medieval struggle with bad light never really ended. It just shifted materials. Medieval furniture tells a similar story. Chairs, tables, and beds were often crude, heavy, and uncomfortable. Beds were filled with straw or hay that attracted insects and absorbed moisture. Mattresses flattened quickly and smelled worse over time. Tables were temporary boards laid across trestles, collapsing or tipping when weight shifted. Chairs were rare and often reserved for authority figures, not comfort. These products failed because comfort wasn't prioritized the way durability and symbolism were. A chair was a sign of power, not a place to relax. A bed was somewhere to collapse, not recover. Yet modern furniture still carries traces of this logic. We still accept discomfort in the name of aesthetics, tradition, or price. We still buy beds that look good but don't support us, chairs that signal status more than comfort. Medieval furniture didn't succeed as a product, but it succeeded in defining expectations. Clothing itself was another ongoing medieval failure. Fabrics were coarse, dyes were unstable, and garments wore out quickly. Wool scratched, linen wrinkled and tore, colors faded or bled unpredictably. Clothes shrank when washed and stiffened when dried. Despite this, clothing styles persisted for generations with only minor changes. People mended endlessly, patched creatively, and reused fabric until it was barely recognizable. This wasn't nostalgia. It was necessity. Clothing failed constantly, but replacing it entirely was expensive and time-consuming. The medieval solution was repair culture, something modern society is now rediscovering after centuries of disposable fashion. When people today complain about clothes that don't last, they're echoing a frustration medieval people knew intimately. As we move deeper into this story, you'll start to notice a pattern. Medieval products didn't fail once and disappear. They failed daily and stayed anyway. Each failure reshaped habits, routines, and expectations. The objects themselves survived because people adapted around them, not because they worked well. When medieval people talked about health, they weren't talking about comfort, prevention, or convenience. They were talking about survival. And the products meant to protect health were some of the most dramatic failures of the age. What makes them fascinating is that many of their core ideas never went away. They were flawed, dangerous, and often useless, yet modern versions still sit in bathrooms, medicine cabinets, and hospitals today. Start with medieval medicine itself. Remedies were sold with confidence but built on misunderstanding. Bloodletting tools, for example, were among the most common medical products in Europe for centuries. Knives, lancets, and cups designed to remove blood were everywhere, owned not just by doctors but by barbers and households. The theory was simple and wrong. Illness came from imbalance, and removing blood would restore harmony. In reality, bloodletting weakened patients, increased infection risk, and often accelerated death. As a product, bloodletting tools failed spectacularly. They didn't cure disease. They spread it. They turned survivable illnesses into fatal ones. And yet the tools persisted because the theory behind them was trusted. People didn't judge the product by results. They judged it by authority. When modern people unquestioningly trust poorly tested wellness trends, supplements, or extreme detox routines, they're repeating the same medieval mistake. The packaging has changed. The logic hasn't. Hygiene products were no better. Soap existed, but it was harsh, inconsistent, and often irritating. Medieval soap was made from animal fat and wood ash, producing lye-heavy mixtures that stripped oils from skin and damaged it with repeated use. Washing too often was believed to weaken the body, so soap was used sparingly. When it was used, it often caused rashes, cracked skin, and infections through broken barriers. Soap failed as a gentle cleaning product, but it survived because people could see dirt being removed. That visible effect mattered more than long-term health. Even today, many cleaning products prioritize strong sensation over actual benefit. Burning, tingling, or harsh smells are still mistakenly associated with effectiveness. That belief was born in medieval kitchens and washrooms. Dental care was another quiet disaster. Tooth powders made from crushed bones, charcoal, herbs, or even brick dust were common. These abrasive mixtures wore down enamel quickly. Toothaches were treated with poultices, prayers, or extraction using crude pliers. Medieval dental tools failed in precision, hygiene, and pain management, but the basic idea of mechanical cleaning survived. Brushing, scraping, polishing all continued into modern dentistry, refined only after centuries of damage. If you've ever wondered why dental anxiety feels ancient, it's because it is. Medieval products taught people that mouth care was painful, risky, and unpleasant. That cultural memory lingers more than we realize. Now step into the medieval household, where failure was woven into daily routine. Heating products are a perfect example. Fireplaces were inefficient, smoky, and dangerous. They heated unevenly, wasted fuel, and filled rooms with smoke that irritated eyes and lungs. Chimneys were a later improvement, but early ones were poorly designed and frequently clogged. Fires spread easily, and entire towns burned because heating products failed to contain what they were built around. Yet people gathered around these fires nightly. They cooked, talked, slept, and worked beside something that could kill them in minutes. The modern obsession with fire safety, ventilation, and energy efficiency is a direct response to this medieval failure. Central heating didn't appear because fireplaces worked. It appeared because they didn't. Storage products were another subtle failure. Chests, barrels, and sacks were used to store food, clothing, and valuables. They were vulnerable to moisture, pests, and theft. Grain spoiled, cloth molded, rodents chewed through wood and leather with ease. Locks existed but were crude and easily bypassed. Storage failed at preservation and security, but it persisted because there was no alternative. This shaped medieval behavior. People consumed quickly. They salted, smoked, or dried food aggressively to compensate. They layered storage methods, hiding valuable items inside other items. Even today, modern packaging echoes medieval anxiety about spoilage and protection. Vacuum sealing, preservatives, and security features are all answers to problems medieval storage never solved. Midway through the story, it's worth pausing for a moment. If you're finding yourself surprised by how familiar these failures feel, go ahead and tap like. It tells the algorithm that slow, thoughtful history still has a place. Tools for everyday labor were equally flawed. Farming implements, for example, were heavy, poorly balanced, and inconsistent. Plows broke frequently. Handles splintered. Metal parts dulled quickly. These tools demanded constant maintenance and physical strain. As products, they failed at efficiency, but they defined work itself. Farming schedules, crop choices, and labor division were all shaped around tool limitations. Modern ergonomic design exists because medieval tools hurt people. Carpal tunnel, back pain, joint damage, these aren't modern problems. They're ancient ones with modern names. The tools failed, so bodies adapted, often at great cost. Writing and record-keeping tools also deserve attention. Quills snapped easily. Ink spilled, faded, or smeared. Parchment was expensive and unforgiving. Errors couldn't be erased cleanly. Writing products failed at convenience and reliability, but they persisted because communication mattered more than comfort. The frustration of medieval scribes lives on every time modern people fight with glitchy software, corrupted files, or fragile devices. Different medium, same vulnerability. The pattern is clearer than ever. Medieval products failed not quietly, but constantly. They failed in ways that shaped behavior, belief, and even personality. People became cautious, adaptable, and skeptical, not because life was romantic, but because their tools demanded it. Before we move on, stay with the rhythm of this story. Nothing resets here. We're still walking forward through the same world, just stepping outside the house now. And if you're listening on your phone while doing something else, that's perfect. This story was built for that kind of quiet attention. Once medieval people left their homes, they entered a landscape shaped almost entirely by failed products. Roads, vehicles, navigation tools, and trade systems were all supposed to make movement easier. Instead, they turned travel into one of the most exhausting, dangerous, and unpredictable parts of life. Yet once again, these failures didn't disappear. They evolved, and their descendants still shape how we move today. Start with roads. Medieval roads were not engineered in any modern sense. Many were simply ancient Roman roads left to decay, or dirt paths worn into the ground by repeated use. They turned into mud traps in rain, dust clouds in summer, and ice rinks in winter. Stones shifted. Ruts formed deep enough to snap axles. Drainage was poor or non-existent. Roads failed at consistency, safety, and durability. But trade depended on them, so people adapted. Travel schedules followed seasons, not clocks. Merchants accepted loss as normal. Goods arrived damaged, late, or not at all. This shaped pricing, contracts, and trust systems. The modern obsession with logistics, tracking numbers, and guaranteed delivery dates is a direct response to centuries of unreliable movement. Medieval roads failed so badly that they taught societies to fear distance itself. Vehicles were no better. Carts and wagons were heavy, rigid, and uncomfortable. Suspension was primitive or non-existent. Wheels cracked under stress. Axles overheated. A single failure could strand a traveler miles from help. As products, these vehicles failed at comfort and reliability, but they persisted because carrying goods by hand was worse. People planned journeys around breakdowns. They carried tools and spare parts. Inns existed not for luxury, but for survival when transport failed. Even today, roadside assistance, rest stops, and vehicle maintenance culture trace their roots to this medieval reality. Transportation didn't get better because medieval carts worked. It got better because they didn't. Navigation tools were another quiet disaster. Maps were rare, inaccurate, and often symbolic rather than practical. They emphasized religious meaning over geography. Compasses existed but were unreliable and misunderstood. Most navigation relied on landmarks, memory, and local guides. Get lost once and you might never recover. Navigation products failed at precision, but they shaped human confidence and caution. Travelers learned to move slowly, ask questions, and avoid unfamiliar routes. This mindset survived into modern GPS anxiety, where people still fear wrong turns, dead zones, and system errors. The medieval fear of getting lost never truly went away. Trade itself relied on measurement tools that frequently failed. Scales were inconsistent. Weights varied by region. Measuring sticks changed length depending on who made them. Merchants cheated, sometimes openly. Disputes were common because the tools meant to ensure fairness were unreliable. Instead of fixing the tools, societies built social systems around mistrust. Witnesses, seals, reputations, and guild memberships mattered more than numbers. Even today, branding, reviews, and certifications exist because people still don't fully trust measurements alone. Medieval measurement products failed, but the workaround became permanent. Public infrastructure suffered from similar problems. Bridges collapsed. Wells dried up or became contaminated. Town walls cracked and shifted. Sewage systems were crude channels that overflowed easily. These products failed at durability and sanitation, contributing to disease and disaster. Yet they were celebrated as achievements simply because they existed. People adjusted behavior again. Waste disposal became ritualized. Water sources were guarded carefully. Town layouts reflected fear of collapse and contamination. Modern urban planning, zoning laws, and infrastructure inspections are all descendants of medieval failure. We don't build rules because medieval systems worked. We build them because they failed catastrophically. Money itself was a product that often failed. Coins were clipped, shaved, or debased. Values fluctuated wildly. Counterfeits circulated easily. People weighed coins instead of counting them. Trust in currency depended more on the ruler's reputation than the metal itself. This failure shaped medieval psychology. People valued tangible goods over abstract wealth. Hoarding wasn't greed. It was survival. Even today, economic fear during instability echoes medieval instincts shaped by unreliable money systems. If you're halfway through this and realizing how much modern life is still reacting to ancient problems, that's the point. And if you're enjoying the depth of the story, now's a good time to tap like. It helps more than you think. Communication infrastructure also struggled. Messengers traveled slowly. Letters were lost, stolen, or delayed. Seals broke. Information aged quickly. As a product, medieval communication failed at speed and security. But it shaped patience, redundancy, and oral tradition. Important messages were repeated, memorized, and backed up by witnesses. Modern communication overload exists partly because medieval communication scarcity trained societies to value information intensely. When something is hard to get, it matters more. When it's easy, it floods. By the time medieval people thought seriously about safety, it was usually already too late. Protection was not a background concern the way it is now. It was immediate, physical, and constantly tested. Every lock, wall, weapon, and piece of armor was expected to stand between a person and real harm. And again, those products failed, not in theory, but in moments when failure meant injury, loss, or death. What's striking is not that these products were flawed, but that people kept trusting them anyway, and in doing so, built habits and beliefs that still shape how we think about safety today. Armor is the most obvious place to begin, because it represents one of the clearest medieval contradictions. Armor promised protection, but it delivered exhaustion. A full suit of mail or plate could weigh more than 50 pounds. Wearing it for hours strained joints, slowed breathing, and trapped heat. Soldiers didn't just fight enemies. They fought their own equipment. Marching long distances in armor caused blisters, muscle failure, and dehydration long before combat began. Mail armor failed especially badly against blunt force. A mace or hammer didn't need to cut through metal to be effective. The impact alone shattered bones beneath the rings. Plate armor improved resistance but introduced new failures. Poorly fitted pieces pinched nerves, limited peripheral vision, and restricted balance. In muddy fields or uneven terrain, falling in armor could mean being unable to stand back up without help. And yet armor persisted not because it worked perfectly, but because it worked just enough. It reduced fear. It gave wearers confidence to step into danger. That psychological effect mattered as much as physical protection. Even now, modern safety gear often serves the same purpose. It doesn't make us invulnerable. It makes risk feel manageable. That idea was forged in medieval battlefields. Weapons themselves were equally unreliable. Swords were expensive and difficult to make well. A poor heat treatment could make a blade brittle. A hidden flaw in the metal could cause it to snap under stress. Bowstrings frayed. Crossbow mechanisms jammed. Spears splintered. A weapon that failed mid-fight didn't just stop working. It turned its owner into a target. Because of this, medieval fighters trained with multiple weapons and learned to fight with whatever was available. Daggers, clubs, rocks, even fists became backups. This culture of redundancy didn't come from strategy manuals. It came from lived experience with unreliable tools. Modern emergency planning, backup systems, and layered defenses all trace back to this same lesson. Assume failure, not success. Defensive structures carried similar illusions. Castles and city walls look permanent in history books, but in reality, they were fragile systems held together by constant labor. Stone cracked with temperature changes. Mortar eroded in rain. Wooden supports rotted. A single neglected section could compromise an entire defense. Most castles didn't fall because attackers were brilliant. They fell because maintenance failed. Supplies ran out. Walls weakened. Gates warped. Siege warfare exploited time, not strength. The longer a defense lasted, the more its products failed under stress. Medieval builders knew this, which is why castles were as much about intimidation as protection. They projected power even when they couldn't guarantee safety. Locks and keys are another revealing failure. Medieval locks were large, simple, and poorly standardized. Keys were often as long as a forearm and required two hands to operate. Many locks could be forced open with basic tools. As a result, theft was common, even expected. People adapted by trusting people, not products. Valuables were hidden rather than locked. Important items stayed close to the body. Communities relied on social punishment instead of mechanical security. Even today, modern security still depends heavily on visibility, reputation, and deterrence. A lock doesn't stop crime on its own. It signals resistance. That idea is medieval. Town protection systems struggled constantly. Night watches were inconsistent and poorly paid. Guards slept, drank, or simply disappeared. Alarm systems depended on human alertness. Bells and horns were useless if no one was awake to hear them or brave enough to respond. Fire protection was perhaps the most catastrophic failure of all. Medieval towns burned regularly. Houses were packed closely together, built from wood, straw, and pitch. Firefighting tools consisted of buckets, hooks, and prayer. Water had to be carried by hand. Fires spread faster than people could react. These failures shaped entire towns. Streets were widened not for beauty, but to slow flames. Curfews existed to reduce nighttime fire risk. Building materials became regulated after disasters. Modern fire codes exist because medieval ones didn't. Legal protection failed in quieter ways. Courts were slow, inconsistent, and deeply biased. Justice products promised order but delivered unpredictability. People learned to avoid legal systems whenever possible. Private settlements, family alliances, and informal agreements mattered more than official rulings. This bred a culture of caution. Trust was personal, not institutional. Even today, skepticism toward authority reflects centuries of lived experience where systems failed to protect those they claimed to serve. Halfway through this part, it's worth pausing. If you're realizing how much modern safety culture is built on old fear rather than new confidence, tap like. It helps this kind of slow history find people who actually want it. Every medieval protection product shared one flaw: It worked best in ideal conditions, and life was never ideal. Rain, mud, fatigue, hunger, human error all exposed weaknesses. People didn't expect perfection. They expected risk. That expectation shaped behavior. People avoided unnecessary travel. They traveled in groups. They slept lightly. They listened for danger. Safety was active, not assumed. As this rewritten part closes, the pattern should feel heavier now, slower, more lived in. Medieval protection products didn't fail once and disappear. They failed repeatedly and taught people how to live with uncertainty. That lesson never left us. Now we move forward, not to a new story, but into the next layer of the same one. Safety shaped how people stayed alive. Food shaped whether they lived at all. And medieval food products failed in slow, grinding ways that didn't always look dramatic, but quietly controlled entire lives. Hunger wasn't a rare crisis. It was a constant threat managed by tools and systems that barely worked, and yet many of those same ideas still sit inside modern kitchens, grocery stores, and supply chains. For most medieval people, food products were not about flavor or choice. They were about survival over time. Preservation mattered more than freshness. Calories mattered more than pleasure. And almost every product designed to store, preserve, or distribute food failed in ways people simply learned to endure. Start with bread, the foundation of medieval diet and one of its greatest quiet failures. Bread was supposed to be reliable, filling, and safe. In reality, it was often inconsistent and sometimes dangerous. Grain quality varied wildly depending on weather, storage, and pests. Flour was ground using stone mills that shed grit into the meal. That grit slowly wore down teeth, leaving many adults with damaged mouths by middle age. Bread molds were common, especially in damp climates. Some molds caused illness, hallucinations, or worse. People didn't know why. They only knew that sometimes bread made you sick. Yet bread remained central because there was no alternative calorie source that could be stored at scale. The product failed, but dependence was absolute. This shaped eating behavior. People toasted old bread to kill mold. They soaked it in broth or ale to make it safer. Even today, many comfort foods are essentially medieval coping mechanisms passed down unconsciously. Food preservation products were even more fragile. Salting, smoking, drying, and pickling were essential techniques, but they were imprecise. Too little salt meant rot. Too much meant inedible food that dehydrated the body. Smoking depended on weather, wood type, and airflow. One mistake ruined weeks of labor. Barrels leaked. Seals failed. Insects found their way in. Meat spoiled quietly, invisibly, until it was too late. People developed strong stomachs not by choice, but by exposure. Mild food poisoning was common enough to be considered normal. Modern food safety obsession exists because medieval preservation failed constantly. Expiration dates, refrigeration, and packaging aren't luxuries. They are reactions to centuries of loss. Dairy products were another daily gamble. Milk spoiled quickly. Cheese varied wildly in quality. Butter went rancid. Without consistent temperature control, dairy products were unpredictable. Yet they were essential sources of fat and protein. People learned to read food carefully. Smell mattered. Texture mattered. Taste tests were cautious. This created a culture of food awareness that modern people often lack, relying instead on labels and dates. Medieval people trusted their senses because products didn't deserve trust. Cooking itself introduced new failures. Open hearths made temperature control nearly impossible. Pots cracked. Fires flared unpredictably. Meals burned or undercooked easily. Undercooked food caused illness. Overcooked food wasted precious resources. Recipes weren't exact because they couldn't be. Cooking was reactive, not controlled. That flexibility became tradition. Even today, Many traditional recipes are forgiving because they were born in kitchens where tools failed regularly. Food storage in homes was primitive. Chests, sacks, and hooks kept food off the floor but not safe from rodents, insects, or moisture. Rats were constant companions. Grain stores were vulnerable. A single infestation could wipe out a family's reserves. This shaped architecture. Houses included elevated storage, thick walls, and dedicated food rooms. Modern pantries, containers, and pest control exist because medieval storage didn't work. Markets and food distribution systems also struggled. Transportation failures meant food arrived late or damaged. Spoilage during travel was expected. Prices fluctuated wildly. Famine wasn't always caused by lack of food, but by failure to move it reliably. As a result, communities developed strict food laws, guild controls, and inspection rituals. Bakers could be punished severely for bad bread, not because they were evil, but because the system was fragile. Even today, food regulation is rooted in fear of scarcity, not abundance. Midway through this part, if you're realizing how much anxiety still surrounds food despite modern abundance, go ahead and like the video. This story explains why that anxiety never fully disappears. Alcohol deserves special mention because it was one of the few food products that worked better than water. Beer and ale were safer to drink than many water sources because fermentation killed pathogens. But brewing was inconsistent. Strength varied. Contamination happened. Alcohol content was unpredictable. People drank not for pleasure, but safety. Even children consumed weak ale. Modern alcohol culture has very different meanings, but its survival as a staple product began as a workaround for failed sanitation. Hunger shaped morality too. Waste was sinful because it was dangerous. Sharing food was survival logic, not generosity. Hoarding was protection, not greed. These attitudes echo today whenever food insecurity spikes. Now the story moves inward, away from walls and food stores, and into the body itself. Medieval health products were everywhere, used daily, trusted desperately, and failing constantly. Illness wasn't an interruption to life. It was part of the background. People expected pain, weakness, and early death, and the tools meant to prevent or treat those things often made them worse. Still, many of those same ideas survive today, reshaped, refined, but carrying the same assumptions. Start with medicine, which in the medieval world was less about curing and more about balancing. Doctors believed the body was governed by humors, fluids that needed to stay in equilibrium. When something went wrong, the solution was removal. Bloodletting was the most common medical product in use. Knives, lancets, and leeches were everywhere. They were supposed to release excess blood and restore balance. In practice, bloodletting weakened patients, lowered resistance to infection, and often hastened death. It was used for headaches, fevers, infections, even emotional distress. People trusted it because it did something visible. Pain and bleeding felt like action. Doing nothing felt like surrender. That mindset still exists. Even today, people often trust treatments that feel active or dramatic over those that require patience. Medieval medicine taught us to equate suffering with effectiveness. Herbal remedies were another daily gamble. Some plants genuinely helped. Others poisoned slowly. Dosages were inconsistent. Knowledge was passed orally and distorted over time. One healer's cure was another's toxin. Preparation methods varied. Drying too long reduced potency. Drying too little caused rot. People learned through experience, not evidence. Trial and error shaped medical tradition. Modern pharmaceuticals exist because this uncertainty was unbearable, but the idea of natural remedies still carries medieval trust wrapped in modern language. Surgery was brutal and limited. Without anesthesia or antiseptics, Even minor procedures were dangerous. Tools weren't sterilized. Hands weren't washed. Infection was common and expected. Surgeons worked quickly because speed reduced pain, not because it improved outcomes. Survival depended more on the patient's strength than the surgeon's skill. This created a belief that recovery was a matter of character and resilience, not medical intervention. That belief still appears today when illness is framed as a personal failure instead of a biological event. Pain management products barely existed. Alcohol, herbs, and prayer were the primary options. People lived with chronic pain because there was no alternative. This shaped behavior. People moved carefully. They avoided unnecessary strain. Old injuries never healed properly and became part of identity. Modern pain management debates echo medieval limits. The fear of masking pain versus treating causes comes from centuries when masking pain was the only option. Hygiene products failed quietly but consistently. Soap was rare and expensive. Bathing was infrequent, not because people were dirty by choice, but because water access and heating were difficult. Waste disposal was primitive. Disease spread easily, yet people weren't ignorant. They noticed patterns. Dirty areas smelled worse and made people sick. Clean air mattered. Fresh water mattered. These observations shaped city planning long before germs were understood. Modern sanitation systems are responses to medieval failure, not modern genius. Dental care was nearly non-existent. Teeth decayed early due to gritty bread and lack of cleaning tools. Tooth pain was constant. Extraction was the only solution. Dentists were often barbers with pliers. Infection spread easily from the mouth to the rest of the body. This normalized suffering. Pain was expected. Complaining was weakness. That cultural attitude still surfaces today when people delay care because discomfort feels normal. Childbirth products and practices were some of the most dangerous failures. Midwives relied on experience, not tools. Complications were common. Mortality was high. Herbal aids helped sometimes and harmed others. Women accepted risk because there was no alternative. This shaped family size, inheritance, and social roles. The expectation of loss influenced emotional distance. Even today, modern reproductive care carries echoes of that fear and control. Midway through this part, if you're noticing how many modern health anxieties are inherited rather than invented, go ahead and like the video. Long history explains short tempers. Mental health didn't exist as a category. Depression, anxiety, and trauma were framed as spiritual failures or physical imbalances. Treatment involved prayer, fasting, or isolation. These methods rarely helped, but they gave structure to suffering. Modern mental health stigma traces back to these interpretations. The idea that distress must be justified or punished is medieval at its core. Health products failed not because people were stupid, but because knowledge lagged behind need. People built rituals, habits, and beliefs around unreliable tools because belief filled the gap that science hadn't reached yet. Medieval life ran on time, information, and trust in signals that were supposed to tell people what was happening beyond their own sight. Those products failed constantly, and when they failed, people didn't just miss appointments or misunderstand news. They made bad decisions, started conflicts, missed danger, or lived entire lives guided by information that was wrong, delayed, or distorted. Many of the ways we still struggle with information today were born in this period of unreliable systems. Timekeeping was one of the most fragile medieval products. Mechanical clocks existed, but they were rare, expensive, and wildly inaccurate. Most people relied on church bells, sun position, or habit. Time wasn't precise. It was approximate. Morning, midday, evening, and night were flexible concepts, not fixed units. Church bells were supposed to regulate daily life, but bells depended on people. Someone had to ring them correctly, on time, and consistently. Bells rang late. Bells rang early. Bells were skipped. Weather affected sound travel. In large towns, different bells overlapped and confused people. As a result, time was negotiated socially. Work began when others showed up. Markets opened when crowds gathered. Deadlines were loose because precision wasn't possible. Even today, flexible time expectations in many cultures trace back to centuries when clocks couldn't be trusted. Calendars were another failure point. Dates shifted. Feast days moved. Record-keeping was inconsistent. Many people didn't know their exact birth year. Legal documents referenced events instead of dates, like the winter after the Great Flood. Memory replaced precision. This shaped how history itself was recorded. Chronicles disagree not because writers lied, but because timekeeping products failed. Modern obsession with timestamps and exact records is a reaction to this uncertainty. Communication products failed even more dramatically. Letters took weeks or months to travel if they arrived at all. Messengers were delayed by weather, war, illness, or theft. Messages were lost, intercepted, or altered. There was no guarantee of accuracy. Important decisions were often made based on outdated information. Armies marched toward battles that had already ended. Merchants arrived after markets collapsed. Rulers issued orders that no longer made sense by the time they were received. People learned to expect misinformation. They relied more on local knowledge than distant authority. Trust was personal, not systemic. That instinct still appears today when people trust friends more than institutions. Written information was limited by literacy and materials. Parchment was expensive. Paper was fragile. Ink faded. Books contained copying errors. One mistake repeated through generations became accepted truth. This is how myths hardened into facts. Once written, information gained authority even if it was wrong. Modern misinformation spreads faster, but the logic is the same. People trust what looks official. Public announcements relied on town criers, another unreliable product. Criers misheard messages. They simplified them. They added interpretation. Crowds misunderstood or only partially heard. Noise, distraction, and language barriers distorted meaning. Even laws changed meaning as they were spoken aloud. Enforcement varied based on interpretation. This taught people to listen cautiously and verify through behavior rather than words. Navigation tools failed constantly. Maps were inaccurate. Distances were guessed. Directions relied on landmarks that changed. Travelers got lost easily. Journeys took longer than planned. Supply calculations failed. As a result, travel was slow and conservative. People avoided unnecessary movement. When they traveled, they overprepared. Modern travel anxiety echoes this uncertainty, even when GPS works perfectly. Signals for danger failed too. Warning fires, horns, and flags required visibility and coordination. Fog, darkness, and human error rendered them useless. Attacks often arrived without warning. This created a culture of vigilance. People watched constantly. They listened for changes. They assumed surprise. Even now, emergency alerts exist because medieval warning systems didn't work reliably. Midway through this part, if you're noticing how modern information overload feels different but oddly familiar, go ahead and like the video. This history explains why clarity still feels rare. Measurement tools failed quietly but shaped trade and trust. Scales were inaccurate. Weights varied by region. Lengths were estimated. Merchants argued constantly. Cheating wasn't always intentional. Standards simply didn't exist. This forced negotiation into every transaction. People inspected goods personally. Reputation mattered more than certification. Modern brand trust evolved from this personal vetting system. Education products also failed. Learning depended on access, memory, and repetition. Schools were limited. Knowledge transmission was fragile. One teacher's bias shaped generations. This created uneven knowledge landscapes. Some towns were informed. Others lived centuries behind. Even today, educational inequality echoes these early failures. This part stretches outward again into roads, vehicles, animals, and the simple act of moving from one place to another. In the medieval world, transportation products failed so often that distance itself became a kind of threat. Travel wasn't just slow. It was uncertain, dangerous, and physically punishing. And because movement was unreliable, it reshaped how people traded, settled, married, fought, and imagined the world beyond their village. Many modern habits around commuting, logistics, and travel anxiety still carry the weight of these early failures. Medieval roads were the first major failure. Most were not roads in the modern sense at all. They were dirt paths shaped by repeated use, weather, and erosion. In dry seasons, they were dusty and uneven. In rain, they turned into mud traps that swallowed carts, animals, and sometimes people. Maintenance was rare and local. A road might be passable one year and nearly unusable the next. Roman roads still existed in some regions, but they were crumbling relics. Without centralized upkeep, stones loosened, drainage failed, and surfaces collapsed. People avoided them when they became more dangerous than open ground. The idea of a permanent, reliable road network had already failed once, and medieval society inherited the consequences. Carts and wagons were fragile products pushed beyond their limits. Wooden wheels cracked, iron rims bent, axles snapped under uneven loads. Repairs required skilled labor and materials that weren't always available on the road. A broken wheel could strand a traveler for days or weeks. This forced people to plan travel conservatively. Loads were kept small. Journeys were broken into short segments. Planning mattered more than speed. Modern shipping redundancies and just-in-case logistics exist because medieval transport failed constantly. Animals, the engines of medieval transport, were unreliable in their own ways. Horses required constant care, feeding, and rest. They became injured easily. Hoofs cracked. Illness spread quickly. A lame horse wasn't just inconvenient. It ended a journey. Oxen were stronger but slower. Donkeys were durable but limited. Each animal represented a compromise. People didn't choose the best option. They chose the least likely to fail in their conditions. This mindset still appears in vehicle choices today, where reliability often matters more than performance. Saddles, harnesses, and tack were another quiet failure point. Poorly fitted equipment injured animals, reduced efficiency, and shortened working life. Small design flaws caused long-term damage. Many animals were worked until collapse because replacement was cheaper than care. This normalized wear and loss. Transportation was expected to break down. Travel plans included failure as a given. Even now, breakdowns feel stressful not because they are new, but because we inherited an old expectation that movement is fragile. Water travel promised efficiency but delivered risk. Boats leaked, hulls warped, sails tore. Navigation depended on weather and guesswork. Rivers flooded unpredictably. Ships wrecked frequently, often within sight of shore. Yet water transport persisted because land routes were worse. This forced medieval trade to cluster along rivers and coasts. Entire cities exist where they do because other transportation products failed too often. Bridges were among the most feared structures. Many were wooden, narrow, and poorly anchored. Floods washed them away. Overloaded bridges collapsed. Crossing one meant trusting craftsmanship you couldn't verify. This created rituals and superstitions around bridges. People prayed before crossing. Tolls funded repairs, but corruption and neglect were common. Modern infrastructure inspection exists because medieval bridges failed without warning. Travel safety products barely existed. There were no reliable maps, no standardized signs, no emergency services. Travelers relied on inns, monasteries, and goodwill. Many journeys depended entirely on hospitality networks. Inns themselves were inconsistent. Some were safe, others were dangerous. Robbery, illness, and fraud were common. Travelers slept lightly, guarded belongings, and trusted instincts over promises. Modern hotel ratings are a response to centuries of uncertainty. Weather amplified every failure. Rain destroyed roads. Snow blocked passes. Heat exhausted animals. Storms delayed ships indefinitely. Travel calendars were seasonal because products couldn't handle variation. This limited trade windows and shaped economic cycles. Modern supply chains still feel weather shocks because the memory of seasonal fragility never fully disappeared. Midway through this part, if you've ever felt anxious about delays, breakdowns, or misconnections, go ahead and like the video. That anxiety has a long history. Fear accompanied travel constantly. Bandits exploited predictable routes. Broken carts made easy targets. Law enforcement was inconsistent. Protection depended on numbers and reputation. This discouraged mobility. Most people lived and died within a short distance of where they were born. When movement did happen, it mattered. Journeys marked life transitions, not casual choices. Measurement of distance was unreliable too. Miles varied. Travel times were estimates. Promises of arrival meant little. This shaped communication language itself. Soon and far were flexible words. Modern impatience with delays reflects a world that forgot how uncertain movement once was. The frustration remains, even when failure rates are far lower. Now the story tightens around the body again, not through illness this time, but through clothing, textiles, and personal gear. These were not fashion choices in the medieval world. They were survival products. When they failed, people froze, overheated, developed infections, or lost social standing. And they failed constantly. Medieval clothing was fragile, expensive, slow to produce, and deeply unreliable. Yet many of the assumptions we still carry about clothes, durability, and identity were formed inside these failures. For most medieval people, clothing began with fabric, and fabric itself was a problem before it ever became a garment. Wool, linen, and occasionally silk were the primary materials, and each came with serious limitations. Wool kept people warm, but it absorbed water easily and became heavy, itchy, and slow to dry. Linen breathed better but offered little insulation. Silk was strong but rare and impractical for daily life. Textile production was slow and labor-intensive. Spinning thread took hours. Weaving took days or weeks. A single garment represented an enormous investment of time. That meant clothes were worn until they failed completely. There was no concept of seasonal replacement. Failure was expected, not avoided. Wool garments shrank, stretched, and warped with use. Rain ruined cloaks. Sweat stiffened fabric. Dirt embedded itself permanently. Washing was difficult and damaging. Many garments were never properly cleaned because cleaning shortened their lifespan. This taught people to tolerate discomfort. It also taught them to layer strategically, a habit we still use today. Modern layering systems didn't come from sports science. They came from centuries of unreliable fabric. Shoes were among the worst failures. Most medieval shoes were thin leather soles with minimal support. They wore out quickly, absorbed moisture, and offered little protection from cold or sharp ground. Foot infections were common. Blisters turned into open wounds. Walking long distances caused chronic pain. Yet shoes were expensive. Many people wore broken shoes or went barefoot when possible. This shaped posture, gait, and even bone structure over time. Foot pain was normal. Even today, debates about footwear durability and support echo these early failures. Outerwear promised protection but rarely delivered fully. Cloaks blocked wind but not rain. Hoods limited vision. Fastenings failed. Pins bent or fell out. Buttons were rare and fragile. A sudden storm could soak a person completely within minutes. Cold was a constant presence. Hypothermia wasn't named, but it was known. People slept clothed, shared beds, and huddled near fire not for comfort, but survival. Modern insulation standards are a direct response to medieval exposure. Clothing also failed socially. Dress signaled status, profession, and morality, but garments wore down unevenly. A torn sleeve or faded dye could be read as moral failure or poverty. Not wear. This created anxiety around appearance that went far beyond vanity. Sumptuary laws attempted to control who could wear what, but enforcement was inconsistent. Clothing products failed to maintain clear social boundaries, leading to constant tension. Even today, clothing still communicates identity, often unfairly, based on condition rather than intent. Personal gear failed just as often. Belts stretched, pouches tore, knives rusted, straps broke. Items fell and were lost. Carrying essentials securely was harder than it sounds. A drop tool might be irreplaceable. This taught minimalism. People carried only what they could protect. Modern pocket design, bags, and secure fastenings exist because medieval gear couldn't be trusted. Armor-adjacent clothing introduced its own failures. Gambesons and padded layers were meant to cushion blows, but they trapped heat, absorbed sweat, and became breeding grounds for bacteria. Skin infections were common. Chafing turned into open sores. These garments worked best briefly, not over time. That shaped combat duration and tactics. Battles weren't marathons. They were short, explosive events because equipment punished endurance. Children's clothing failed quickly too. Kids outgrew garments before they wore them out, forcing constant alteration. Hand-me-downs were the norm. This normalized repair culture. Clothes were patched, resewn, and repurposed endlessly. Modern fast fashion feels new, but the instinct to stretch clothing life comes from a world where failure was expected and replacement was slow. Dyes and colors were another unreliable product. Natural dyes faded unevenly. Sunlight changed color. Washing stripped pigment. A bright garment became dull quickly. Color loss signaled aging, not neglect. This shaped symbolic meaning. Bright colors meant youth, wealth, and freshness. Dull colors meant labor and age. These associations still influence modern fashion unconsciously. Midway through this part, if you've ever kept wearing something uncomfortable simply because it still works, go ahead and like the video. That habit is older than you think. Weather magnified every failure. Rain made clothes heavier. Snow froze fabric stiff. Heat caused rashes and dehydration. Clothing didn't adapt. People did. This led to behavioral adaptation. People avoided travel in bad weather. They planned tasks around seasons. They accepted limits. Modern weather-based planning is inherited from this era. Clothing repair was constant. Needles broke. Threads snapped. Poor repairs failed quickly. Skilled mending was valuable. Clothing failure supported entire trades. Today's disposable clothing culture exists only because production outpaced failure. The expectation of failure is still there, even if the cause has changed. Household tools were the backbone of medieval survival. They shaped how food was cooked, clothes were repaired, fires were managed, and work was done from morning to night. When these products failed, nothing stopped completely. Life just became harder, slower, and more painful. And because these tools failed so often, medieval people built entire routines around compensating for broken, dull, leaking, or unreliable objects. Many modern household habits still quietly assume that tools will fail eventually, because that expectation was trained into daily life for centuries. Start with fire, the most essential domestic element and one of the least reliable. Fire meant heat, light, cooking, and safety. But medieval fire-making tools were inconsistent. Flint and steel worked only when dry and properly struck. Tinder had to be prepared carefully and stored well. Damp weather ruined everything. A lost spark could mean hours of effort. Keeping a fire alive mattered more than starting a new one. Hearths were banked overnight with ash to preserve embers. Someone always carried responsibility for the flame. If a fire went out in winter, restarting it could be dangerous. This created anxiety around something modern people treat casually. Even today, backup power systems echo this ancient fear of losing heat and light. Cooking tools failed constantly. Pots cracked from uneven heat. Metal warped. Handles loosened. Clay vessels shattered without warning. There was no temperature control, no even heat distribution. Food burned easily. Undercooked food caused illness. Every meal carried risk. This forced attentiveness. Cooking demanded presence, not multitasking. Modern warnings about unattended cooking exist because medieval kitchens punished distraction harshly. Knives were central household tools, and they dulled quickly. Sharpening stones were imperfect. Over-sharpening weakened blades. Under-sharpening made work dangerous. A dull knife slipped more easily than a sharp one, causing frequent injuries. Cuts were common. Infection followed. People worked through pain because stopping wasn't an option. This normalized minor injury as part of daily labor. Even today, many people accept small household injuries as unavoidable. Water handling tools were another failure point. Buckets leaked. Ropes frayed. Wells collapsed. Drawing water was heavy, repetitive labor. Spills wasted effort. Clean water wasn't guaranteed even when it looked clear. This shaped water use habits. Water was conserved carefully. Washing was limited. Spills caused frustration not because water was rare, but because effort was expensive. Modern water-saving habits trace back to this labor memory. Lighting tools failed nightly. Candles were expensive and burned unevenly. Tallow smelled and smoked. Oil lamps leaked and tipped over. Wicks required trimming. Light flickered unpredictably. Darkness controlled behavior. People slept early. Work schedules followed daylight. Even now, artificial lighting hasn't fully erased the instinct to slow down at night. Furniture was crude and unreliable. Chairs broke. Tables wobbled. Beds sagged. Mattresses were sacks of straw that compressed quickly and harbored insects. Sleep quality suffered. This shaped posture, rest habits, and chronic pain. The idea of good sleep as a right didn't exist. Sleep was recovery when possible, not guaranteed comfort. Modern sleep culture reacts against this long deprivation. Cleaning tools barely worked. Brooms spread dust more than removed it. Cloths pushed dirt around. Soap was limited. Homes stayed smoky, dirty, and cluttered not from neglect, but from ineffective tools. This normalized mess. Cleanliness standards were different because perfection was impossible. Even today, people tolerate a baseline level of disorder shaped by generations of limited control. Textile repair tools also failed frequently. Needles bent or broke. Threads snapped. Poor stitching unraveled quickly. Clothing repair was constant, but rarely permanent. This taught acceptance of imperfection. Visible repairs were normal. Function mattered more than appearance. Modern, distressed aesthetics accidentally echo this practicality. Storage tools were unreliable. Chests warped. Lids didn't seal. Moisture entered. Food spoiled. Rodents chewed through barriers. Nothing stayed secure for long. This forced constant checking. Items were inspected daily. Forgetting something meant losing it. Modern inventory habits evolved from this vigilance. Children learned tool use early because failure had consequences. A mistake with fire, water, or knives caused harm quickly. Childhood wasn't protected. It was trained. This created competence early and caution lifelong. Even today, many adult anxieties come from early lessons about fragility and responsibility. Midway through this part, if you've ever felt tired just managing everyday objects, go ahead and like the video. That fatigue has deep roots. Domestic noise mattered too. Creaking wood, boiling pots, crackling fires all signaled function or danger. Silence was suspicious. People listened constantly. This shaped alertness. Background awareness became instinct. Modern discomfort with complete silence may come from this heritage. Failures stacked. A broken pot led to missed meals. Missed meals weakened bodies. Weakened bodies made work harder. Household tool failure cascaded into survival risk. This interconnectedness trained people to respect small things. No object was trivial. Modern frustration over minor household failures echoes this old understanding. Money, trade tools, and early financial systems were supposed to make life easier. They were meant to simplify exchange, reduce conflict, and create trust between people who didn't know each other. Instead, medieval financial products failed constantly, quietly, and unevenly. When they broke down, the damage didn't look dramatic at first. It showed up as suspicion, stalled trade, resentment, and slow economic collapse that people felt but couldn't easily explain. Many modern anxieties around money, pricing, and fairness are inherited directly from these failures. Start with coins themselves, the most basic financial product. Medieval coins varied wildly in size, weight, metal content, and purity. A silver coin might look identical to another but contain far less silver. Clipping, shaving, and debasement were common. Edges were filed down bit by bit until value disappeared invisibly. As a result, every transaction involved inspection. Coins were bitten, weighed, tapped, and examined. Trust wasn't automatic. It had to be confirmed physically. Even then, mistakes happened. People accepted bad coins unknowingly and passed them along out of necessity. This created constant tension. Money wasn't a stable reference point. Prices fluctuated not just because of supply and demand, but because currency itself was unreliable. Modern distrust of inflation and hidden devaluation comes from this lived experience of money quietly failing. Paper money barely existed for most medieval people, and when it did appear, it was viewed with suspicion. Value that couldn't be touched felt dangerous. Promissory notes relied entirely on reputation. If trust broke, the paper was worthless. That skepticism never disappeared. Even today, abstract financial instruments feel risky because medieval people learned that invisible value collapses faster than physical goods. Scales and weights were another major failure. There were no universal standards. A pound in one town wasn't the same as a pound in another. Merchants carried their own weights, which were often accused of being dishonest even when they weren't. Trade became negotiation-heavy. Buyers watched closely. Sellers defended themselves constantly. Arguments were routine. Markets weren't calm places. They were loud, tense, and emotional. This shaped commercial behavior. People preferred dealing with familiar faces. Long-term relationships mattered more than one-time profit. Brand loyalty today echoes this instinct to stick with what feels proven. Credit systems existed but were fragile. Loans were often informal. recorded by memory or simple marks. Repayment depended on harvests, weather, and health. One bad season ruined entire networks. Debt carried moral weight. Owing money wasn't just financial, it was personal. Shame followed failure. This emotional framing of debt still influences how people feel about borrowing, even in modern systems designed to be impersonal. Banking institutions were rare and inconsistent. Early banks collapsed frequently due to fraud, war, or mismanagement. Depositors lost everything overnight. There was no insurance, no safety net. This taught people to distrust centralized financial power. Wealth was spread across land, goods, and favors rather than stored in one place. Diversification wasn't a strategy. It was survival. Contracts existed, but enforcement was unreliable. Courts were slow. Outcomes depended on status. Written agreements didn't guarantee protection. People relied on witnesses, oaths, and community pressure instead of legal certainty. Modern contract obsession exists because medieval ones failed too often. Every clause, signature, and verification is a response to centuries of broken promises. Trade guilds formed partly to compensate for these failures. They regulated quality, prices, and behavior. But guilds also failed, becoming restrictive, corrupt, or exclusionary. This created tension between stability and innovation. Products improved slowly because systems resisted change. Even today, regulation struggles to balance protection and progress. Taxes were another unreliable product. Collection methods were inconsistent. Rates changed unpredictably. Corruption was common. People hid income and goods to survive. This normalized tax avoidance as a rational behavior. Distrust of taxation systems today reflects this long history of arbitrary extraction. Midway through this part, if money sometimes feels stressful even when you're doing everything right, go ahead and like the video. That stress didn't start with you. Wages fluctuated wildly. Payment might be delayed, reduced, or made in goods instead of coins. Workers couldn't rely on steady income. Planning was difficult. This shaped saving behavior. People stored value in objects, animals, or favors. Even today, people often feel safer owning tangible assets than trusting numbers on a screen. Fraud was common because verification was hard. Fake weights, false measures, and misleading claims thrived in low-information environments. People became skeptical by necessity. This skepticism still appears whenever new financial products promise ease or speed. The instinctive question is ancient. What happens when it fails? Inheritance systems failed quietly too. Wills were contested. Records were lost. Property disputes lasted generations. Wealth transfer was unstable. This shaped family structures. Alliances mattered more than documents. Marriage was financial strategy as much as personal choice. Now moves into belief, ritual, and meaning, where product failure didn't break bodies or wallets directly, but quietly shaped fear, hope, guilt, and obedience. Medieval religious and spiritual products were everywhere, woven into daily life so deeply that failure was often invisible. When they didn't work, people didn't abandon them. They blamed themselves. And many of the emotional habits that still surround belief, morality, and comfort were forged inside these systems. Religion in the medieval world was not just faith. It was infrastructure. It organized time, explained suffering, regulated behavior, and promised protection where no physical tool could. Religious products were objects, rituals, services, and promises, and they failed constantly in ways people were trained not to question. Start with prayer, the most common spiritual tool. Prayer was expected to heal illness, protect travelers, save crops, and influence outcomes. Sometimes it appeared to work. Often it didn't. Crops still failed. People still died. Storms still destroyed homes. When prayer failed, the failure was never assigned to the product. It was assigned to the user. Faith wasn't strong enough. Words weren't sincere enough. Sin interfered. This created a system that could never be wrong, only demanding. Even today, many belief systems operate this way, protecting the idea by transferring blame inward. Relics were another powerful product. Bones, clothing fragments, tools associated with saints were believed to offer protection and healing. Churches competed to acquire them. Pilgrims traveled dangerous roads to touch them. Many relics were fake or duplicated. Multiple churches claimed the same saint's bones. Miracles were inconsistent. Still, belief persisted because the product's value wasn't in reliability. It was in hope. Hope mattered even when results didn't follow. This created a marketplace of belief where authenticity was impossible to verify. Modern skepticism toward miracle cures and spiritual commodities traces back to this era of untestable claims. Indulgences were a more transactional spiritual product. People paid money to reduce punishment for sins, either in life or after death. The system promised relief from guilt and fear. In practice, it exploited anxiety and delivered nothing measurable. This failure destabilized trust and eventually sparked major religious reform. The idea that morality could be purchased failed under scrutiny, but the emotional logic behind it never disappeared. Even now, people seek shortcuts to forgiveness, peace, or redemption. Confession was another deeply personal product. Promised relief through disclosure. In many cases, it worked emotionally, but it also reinforced surveillance and control. Privacy didn't exist. Thoughts became accountable. When confession failed to bring relief, people assumed deeper guilt. This shaped modern discomfort around judgment, shame, and moral scrutiny. The habit of self-policing was trained here. Church attendance regulated time. Bells marked days, weeks, seasons. Religious calendars structured labor and rest. But these systems failed frequently. Feasts moved. Observances overlapped. Obligations conflicted with survival needs. People adapted by blending belief with practicality. Rules bent quietly. This created a gap between official doctrine and lived religion. Even today, belief systems often exist more in behavior than in strict adherence. Protective charms, blessings, and rituals filled gaps left by failing physical products. Homes were marked. Fields were blessed. Children wore amulets. These practices didn't prevent disasters reliably, but they reduced anxiety. Modern superstitions and rituals serve the same function. They don't control reality. They make uncertainty tolerable. Clergy themselves were imperfect products of the system. Some were wise and compassionate. Others were corrupt, ignorant, or cruel. Authority failed inconsistently, which made belief both powerful and dangerous. This trained people to separate faith from leaders, even when they couldn't say it openly. Modern distrust of institutions often preserves belief while rejecting authority, a pattern born here. Heaven and hell were ultimate spiritual products, offering explanation for injustice and suffering. They promised balance beyond life. When worldly systems failed, these ideas stabilized society. But they also delayed reform. Suffering was endured instead of challenged. This failure slowed progress while preserving order. Even today, the tension between acceptance and change echoes this compromise. Midway through this part, if you've ever noticed how belief can comfort and control at the same time, go ahead and like the video. That duality is ancient. Miracles were unpredictable. Stories spread faster than verification. One healing story overshadowed hundreds of failures. This selective memory reinforced belief. Modern viral success stories operate the same way. Failure fades. Hope spreads. education through religion failed unevenly. Some learned reading through scripture. Others remained illiterate. Knowledge was filtered through doctrine. This shaped intellectual boundaries that lasted centuries. Even today, education debates carry traces of this tension between faith and inquiry. Death rituals were among the most important spiritual products. Funerals, prayers, and rites helped people cope with constant loss. These rituals didn't prevent grief, but they structured it. Modern mourning practices still follow medieval rhythms because grief itself hasn't changed. Now, moves into moments people used to escape pressure rather than survive it. Entertainment, leisure, and storytelling weren't luxuries in the medieval world. They were pressure valves, and the products that delivered them were fragile, inconsistent, and often disappointing. When they failed, people didn't stop seeking relief. They adjusted expectations, lowered standards, and learned to accept brief comfort instead of lasting escape. Many modern entertainment habits still reflect this older relationship with unreliable pleasure. Medieval entertainment products were mostly communal and temporary. There was no on-demand relief. If something went wrong, there was no alternative. A failed performance meant the night was simply worse than expected. That reality shaped patience in ways modern audiences often struggle to recognize. Music was one of the most common forms of entertainment, and it failed constantly. Instruments were sensitive to weather. Strings snapped, wood warped, pitch drifted. Instruments couldn't be tuned precisely or stay in tune for long. A song sounded different every time it was played. Musicians compensated with improvisation. Mistakes were absorbed into performance. Audiences expected variation, not perfection. Even today, live music tolerance comes from centuries of listening to imperfect sound. Public performances were risky. Traveling performers depended on crowds, weather, and local tolerance. Poor turnout meant hunger. Hostile audiences threw objects. Authorities shut performances down unpredictably. This instability shaped humor and storytelling. Performers learned to read crowds quickly. Stories adapted mid-performance. Modern stand-up comedy and live performance anxiety trace back to this fragile environment. Games were another unreliable escape. Board games existed, but pieces were lost. Rules varied by region. Dice were uneven and often suspected of being loaded. Gambling caused conflict because outcomes felt unfair. Rather than eliminating games, people argued about them endlessly. Disputes became part of play. Modern arguments over game balance and fairness echo this tradition of contested fun. Sports and physical games failed through injury. There were no safety standards. Broken bones were common. A bad fall ended a person's ability to work. Yet games continued because physical release mattered. This normalized risk in leisure. Even today, people accept injury risk in sports because enjoyment has always carried danger. Festivals promised joy but delivered unpredictability. Weather ruined plans. Food ran out. Crowds turned violent. Performances failed to appear. Still, festivals remained central to social life. Their failure taught people to value anticipation as much as experience. The build-up mattered even if reality disappointed. Modern hype culture reflects this inherited pattern. Storytelling was the most reliable entertainment product, yet it failed in subtler ways. Stories changed with each telling. Details shifted. Truth blurred. But consistency wasn't the goal. Meaning was. People accepted contradictions because stories served emotional truth, not factual accuracy. Modern fiction still prioritizes feeling over precision, a habit born here. Books were rare and fragile. Pages tore, ink faded, copies differed. A story could be lost permanently. This scarcity gave stories weight. Modern content overload contrasts sharply with this history, yet the desire for meaningful narrative remains unchanged. Visual entertainment was limited. Tapestries faded. Paintings cracked. Colors dulled. Images didn't last. Memory filled the gaps. This trained imagination. People visualized what wasn't shown. Modern discomfort with ambiguity contrasts with this older skill. Children's play relied on found objects. Toys broke easily. Imagination replaced manufacturing. Failure was expected. This encouraged creativity. Even today, children often prefer simple toys because they invite participation rather than deliver perfection. Midway through this part, if entertainment today sometimes feels overwhelming rather than satisfying, go ahead and like the video. That contrast has a long history. Alcohol and feasting were major leisure outlets, but they failed often. Food spoiled. Drink was inconsistent. Celebrations ended early or badly. Excess caused harm. Yet people returned to them because brief release mattered more than reliability. Modern binge cycles echo this medieval release pattern. Theater existed but was rare and fragile. Scripts weren't fixed. Actors forgot lines. Sets collapsed. Audiences accepted chaos. This tolerance for imperfection shaped collective patience. Entertainment wasn't expected to work flawlessly. Even silence was entertainment. Conversation, gossip, shared storytelling filled evenings. Social connection replaced spectacle. Modern loneliness, despite abundant entertainment, reflects the loss of this communal reliance. Now moves into learning, teaching, and the fragile systems that decided who knew what and who never would. Education in the medieval world was not designed to expand understanding widely. It was a narrow bridge, and most people never crossed it. The products that carried knowledge failed constantly, quietly shaping ignorance, authority, and inequality in ways that still echo today. Medieval education products were not classrooms or degrees. They were books, memory systems, teachers, and permission. When any one of those failed, learning stopped completely. There were no backups. Start with books, the most obvious learning product and one of the most unreliable. Books were handwritten, copied slowly by scribes who made mistakes, skipped lines, misunderstood meanings, or corrected texts according to their beliefs. One copying error could become permanent truth for centuries. Ink faded, pages tore, moisture warped parchment. Fire destroyed entire libraries instantly. Knowledge wasn't just fragile, it was temporary. People knew that what existed today might vanish tomorrow. This gave written knowledge immense authority. If something survived long enough to be written down and preserved, it felt sacred. Even today, people trust printed or formal information more than spoken correction, a habit shaped by centuries of scarcity. Access was another failure point. Most people never touched a book. Literacy was rare. Learning depended entirely on proximity to someone who already knew how to read. If that person died, moved, or refused to teach, knowledge ended there. This created intellectual bottlenecks. Entire regions depended on a single monastery or teacher. When that source failed, progress froze. Modern concerns about access to education reflect this inherited fear of gatekeeping. Teaching itself was unreliable. There were no standardized curricula. Lessons depended on memory, interpretation, and bias. Teachers taught what they knew, not necessarily what was true. Personal beliefs shaped entire generations. Mistakes weren't corrected easily. Once learned, wrong ideas persisted because there was no efficient way to update understanding. Even today, outdated beliefs linger because first lessons leave deep marks. Language barriers compounded failure. Latin dominated education, separating learning from daily life. Students memorized words they didn't fully understand. Meaning became abstract and distant. This separation trained obedience over comprehension. Knowledge felt external, owned by authority. Modern discomfort with academic language traces back to this division. Memory was a critical learning product. Without books, people memorized vast amounts of information. But memory failed under stress, illness, and age. Knowledge died with the person. This shaped teaching style. Repetition mattered more than exploration. Rote learning dominated. Creativity was risky. Modern standardized testing echoes this survival-based approach. Schools existed but were limited. Many were attached to religious institutions. Attendance depended on family status, gender, and usefulness. Girls were often excluded entirely. This failure wasn't accidental. Preserved power structures. Knowledge distribution was controlled because uncontrolled learning threatened authority. Even today, education debates often circle this same fear. Scientific learning suffered deeply. Observation existed, but explanation was filtered through tradition. New ideas struggled to survive because they lacked product support. There were no laboratories, no peer review, no replication standards. As a result, progress was slow and uneven. Breakthroughs happened, but they spread poorly. Modern frustration with misinformation mirrors this older struggle between evidence and tradition. Tools for learning mathematics and measurement failed too. Counting boards, abacuses, and tables varied. Errors were common. Trade and construction suffered from inconsistent calculation. This taught estimation over precision. People learned to live with close enough. Even today, many people avoid exact calculation when intuition feels safer. Maps and diagrams used in education were symbolic rather than accurate. They taught meaning, not reality. Students learned worldview, not geography. This shaped how people imagine the world. Even now, mental maps often distort reality based on early teaching rather than experience. Midway through this part, if learning ever felt more about memorizing than understanding, go ahead and like the video. That frustration is ancient. Education also failed socially. Learned people were isolated. Knowledge created distance, not connection. Scholars struggled to communicate with the wider population. This created suspicion toward expertise. Learned speech sounded foreign. Trust favored familiarity. Modern skepticism toward experts echoes this divide. Apprenticeships offered practical education, but they failed in fairness. Masters exploited labor. Skills were withheld to protect status. Progress depended on obedience. This shaped modern workplace dynamics, where training and advancement often feel controlled rather than open. Women's knowledge survived mostly outside formal systems. Medicine, craft, and oral tradition thrived quietly but lacked protection. When those women died, their knowledge vanished. This loss shaped historical gaps that still frustrate researchers today. Nothing speeds up here, because this is where failure becomes frighteningly personal. Law, punishment, and systems of order were meant to protect people from chaos. Instead, they often became tools that produced fear, randomness, and quiet obedience. Medieval legal products didn't fail because they were cruel by accident. They failed because they were built to maintain control more than justice. And many modern instincts around authority, punishment, and distrust were shaped by living inside these unreliable systems. Law in the medieval world was not a stable framework. It was fragmented, overlapping, and deeply inconsistent. Different regions followed different rules. Custom mattered more than written law. What was illegal in one town might be tolerated in another. Enforcement depended less on statutes and more on who you were and who you knew. This meant legal protection was never guaranteed. People learned early that rules were flexible for the powerful and rigid for the weak. That lesson has never fully disappeared. Even today, many people assume fairness is uneven because it once openly was. Courts themselves were unreliable products. Trials were slow, expensive, and unpredictable. Evidence standards varied wildly. Witnesses lied or disappeared. Judges were biased or bribed. Outcomes depended on reputation as much as facts. People avoided courts whenever possible. Disputes were settled privately, through family pressure or compromise, because formal systems failed too often. Modern preference for negotiation and settlement echoes this survival strategy. Punishment tools were especially brutal and often ineffective. Stocks, pillories, whipping, mutilation, and execution were designed to deter crime through spectacle. But crime didn't disappear. Instead, punishment normalized violence. Public punishments failed as deterrents but succeeded as warnings of authority. Fear replaced trust. People obeyed not because laws felt just, but because consequences were visible and severe. This shaped obedience patterns that persist today. Compliance often comes from fear of punishment rather than belief in fairness. Prisons, as we imagine them now, barely existed. Detention was temporary. Conditions were horrific. Disease spread quickly. Prison was not rehabilitation. It was pressure. This failure meant punishment focused on bodies rather than behavior. Change wasn't expected. Survival was. Modern debates about punishment versus reform reflect this long history of failed correction. Policing systems were informal and unreliable. Watchmen were poorly paid and inconsistent. Corruption was common. Protection depended on community vigilance, not authority presence. This taught self-reliance and suspicion. People protected themselves rather than trusting systems. Even today, community-based safety instincts reflect this medieval adaptation. Law enforcement also failed selectively. Crimes against the poor were ignored. Crimes by the powerful were excused. Justice wasn't blind. It was observant of status. This embedded cynicism deeply. People learned that morality and legality weren't the same. That separation still shapes modern ethical debates. Property law was another unstable product. Land boundaries were vague. Records were incomplete. Disputes lasted generations. Violence often settled what documents couldn't. This shaped obsession with ownership clarity. Modern deeds, surveys, and registries exist because medieval property systems failed constantly. Inheritance law caused quiet chaos. Wills were contested. Oral promises conflicted. Family members fought openly. Entire estates were lost to ambiguity. This made succession a moment of vulnerability. Even today, inheritance remains emotionally charged because uncertainty once meant ruin. Religious courts overlapped with secular ones, creating confusion. A behavior punished by one system might be forgiven by another. People navigated between authorities strategically. This trained people to understand power structures intuitively. They learned which rules mattered in which contexts. Modern legal complexity still rewards those who understand systems better than those who trust them. Midway through this part, if legal systems sometimes feel intimidating or unfair even now, go ahead and like the video. That discomfort has a long memory. Crime itself was often redefined to suit authority needs. New rules appeared suddenly. Old ones were ignored. People broke laws without realizing it. This unpredictability created anxiety. Safety came from conformity, not understanding. Even today, many people avoid attention rather than rely on clear rules. Justice rituals reinforced submission. Oaths, public confessions, and symbolic gestures mattered more than truth. Compliance was visible. Resistance was dangerous. This shaped modern courtroom theatrics and procedural rituals, which still emphasize form as much as substance. Punishment failed to heal communities. Victims rarely received closure. Offenders weren't rehabilitated. Cycles repeated. This normalized unresolved harm. Modern restorative justice movements exist because retribution alone failed for centuries. This part widens the lens again because now failure isn't private or quiet. It's loud, collective, and devastating. War in the medieval world was shaped less by strategy and heroism than by unreliable products pushed far beyond their limits. Weapons, armor, logistics, communication, and command systems failed constantly. And when they failed, entire populations paid the price. Many modern assumptions about military caution, redundancy, and skepticism toward perfect plans were born inside these collapses. Medieval warfare relied on tools that looked impressive but performed unpredictably. Armor, as discussed earlier, exhausted bodies quickly. Weapons broke. Horses panicked. But the largest failures weren't individual. They were systemic. Start with logistics, the least visible and most decisive failure. Armies marched on food, water, and fodder, and those supplies were fragile. Grain spoiled, meat rotted, animals starved, roads slowed movement, weather destroyed plans. Supply lines stretched thin and snapped easily. Many medieval campaigns ended not with battles, but with hunger. Soldiers deserted. Morale collapsed. Disease spread through weakened bodies. Commanders often overestimated how long supplies would last, because preservation products failed quietly until suddenly nothing remained. This taught a harsh lesson. An army that cannot feed itself cannot fight. Modern military logistics obsession exists because medieval systems failed catastrophically. Communication during war failed constantly. Orders traveled slowly. Messengers were captured or killed. Signals were misunderstood. Battles began based on outdated information. Reinforcements arrived too late or to the wrong place. Commanders often lost control the moment fighting started. Noise, smoke, and chaos overwhelmed plans. Units acted independently, sometimes fighting allies by mistake. Victory depended more on momentum than instruction. This created a deep mistrust of centralized control. Even today, military doctrine emphasizes flexibility because medieval command systems collapsed under pressure. Weapons technology failed unevenly. Siege engines were powerful but slow to build and maintain. They broke down frequently. Ammunition ran out. Walls resisted longer than expected. Sieges dragged on for months, draining resources. Many sieges ended through negotiation, betrayal, or starvation rather than assault. The tools designed to break defenses failed to deliver quick results. Modern warfare's emphasis on speed reflects a desire to avoid these drawn-out failures. Armor and weapons manufacturing failed at scale. Equipping large armies required massive production that couldn't maintain consistent quality. Poorly made equipment broke quickly. Soldiers entered battle with unreliable gear. This forced improvisation. Weapons were scavenged. Armor was stripped from the dead. Equipment inequality created morale gaps. Even now, supply quality differences affect unit effectiveness deeply. Disease was the greatest failure of all. Armies carried illness with them. Camps were filthy. Sanitation was non-existent. More soldiers died from disease than combat. Medical support during war was minimal and often harmful. Wounds infected easily. Amputations were crude. Recovery was rare. Injury usually meant permanent disability or death. This normalized loss. Commanders expected high casualties. Soldiers accepted it fatalistically. Modern emphasis on medical evacuation and care exists because medieval warfare treated bodies as expendable. Civilian protection products failed almost completely. There were few distinctions between combatants and non-combatants. Towns were looted. Fields burned, people displaced. War wasn't fought on battlefields alone. It consumed entire regions. Refugees moved constantly. Famine followed armies. Social order collapsed. This taught populations to fear armies regardless of allegiance. Even friendly forces were dangerous. Modern civilian protections in war exist because medieval ones didn't. Defensive alliances failed too. Promises of support weren't honored. Politics shifted mid-campaign. Betrayal was common. Treaties were temporary. This trained deep political cynicism. Trust between states was fragile because it had proven unreliable. Modern diplomacy remains cautious for this reason. Weapons innovation often created new failures. New technologies outpaced understanding. Crossbows caused political backlash. Early gunpowder weapons misfired, exploded, or terrified operators more than enemies. Adoption was slow and uneven. Old and new tools mixed poorly. This transitional chaos cost lives. Even today, integrating new military technology brings unexpected risks. Training systems failed inconsistently. Some soldiers trained extensively. Others were levies with little preparation. Mixed skill levels caused breakdowns under stress. This reinforced hierarchy and class divides. Nobles fought differently than common soldiers. Equipment and training followed status, not effectiveness. Modern professional armies exist because medieval ones failed under this inequality. Midway through this part, if you've ever noticed how modern military language emphasizes preparedness and redundancy, go ahead and like the video. Those words were earned through failure. Victory itself was unstable. Winning a battle didn't guarantee peace. Retreating enemies regrouped. Lands were devastated even after success. War rarely solved problems cleanly. This created war fatigue. Populations accepted conflict as recurring, not resolvable. Even today, skepticism toward decisive victory reflects this long memory. Psychological trauma was unrecognized but widespread. Survivors carried fear, guilt, and numbness. There was no concept of recovery. People returned to life changed. This shaped storytelling. War stories emphasized honor to mask suffering. Modern narratives still struggle between realism and myth for the same reason. Cities were supposed to represent progress. Walls, markets, workshops, governance, opportunity. But medieval cities were also places where product failure became constant background pressure. Nothing broke once and stopped. Everything failed slowly, repeatedly, and in layers. Urban life meant living inside systems that barely held together and adapting your behavior so those failures didn't crush you. Many modern urban anxieties trace directly back to this environment of permanent strain. Start with space itself, the most obvious failure. Medieval cities were overcrowded by design. Walls limited expansion. Population growth had nowhere to go. Houses were built upward and inward, blocking light and air. Narrow streets trapped heat, smoke, and waste. Ventilation products didn't exist. Windows were small or shuttered. Fires burned indoors constantly. Smoke blackened walls and lungs. Respiratory illness was common, accepted, unnamed. People coughed their way through life because clean air wasn't a product anyone knew how to provide. Waste management failed almost completely. There were no sewers in most cities. Human waste was stored in pits, barrels, or simply thrown into streets. Rain washed it downhill, spreading contamination. Wells sat dangerously close to waste sources. Water looked clear but carried illness. Cities tried rules. Waste disposal laws existed. Enforcement failed. Infrastructure couldn't support compliance. Even careful people were surrounded by other people's negligence. Disease thrived not because individuals were careless, but because systems couldn't scale. This failure shaped behavior. People avoided certain streets. They memorized smells. They learned which wells to trust. Modern urban navigation instincts, avoiding areas that feel wrong, come from this necessity. Housing products failed constantly. Buildings leaned. Foundations shifted. Roofs leaked. Fires spread easily between tightly packed structures. Entire neighborhoods burned regularly. Reconstruction reused damaged materials because there was no alternative. This normalized impermanence. A home wasn't assumed to last generations. It was temporary shelter. Even today, urban renters often treat living spaces as provisional, not permanent, echoing this mindset. Fire was the city's greatest enemy. Open flames were everywhere. Hearths, workshops, candles. Firefighting tools were primitive. Buckets and hooks couldn't stop fast-moving blazes. Nighttime fires were especially deadly. Cities developed fire watches, but they failed often. Fatigue, weather, and human error intervened. Entire districts disappeared overnight. Modern fire departments exist because medieval ones didn't. Food supply in cities failed unpredictably. Cities produced little of their own food. They relied on fragile transport networks. Delays caused shortages. Spoilage was common. Prices spiked suddenly. Urban hunger wasn't constant, but it was always possible. That fear shaped riots, revolts, and strict market controls. Modern urban food anxiety echoes this inherited instability. Markets themselves were chaotic. Noise, crowding, and misinformation ruled. Weights varied. Quality was inconsistent. Fraud thrived in density. Enforcement was reactive, not preventative. This taught urban dwellers skepticism. People inspected goods carefully. Trust was earned slowly. Modern consumer wariness in crowded markets reflects this long history. Noise pollution was constant. Hammering, animals shouting, carts, bells. Silence was rare. Sleep was interrupted regularly. Chronic fatigue was common. This shaped tolerance. People learned to function tired. Modern urban burnout has deep roots in this sensory overload. Social order in cities was fragile. Crime thrived in density. Policing was weak. Gangs, guilds, and informal power groups controlled neighborhoods. Justice varied by street. People navigated cities through relationships rather than rules. Knowing the right people mattered more than knowing the law. Even today, social navigation often outweighs formal systems. Public health products failed catastrophically during outbreaks. Plagues spread rapidly through crowded conditions. Quarantines were inconsistent. Medical understanding was limited. Cities emptied suddenly. Survivors fled. Economies collapsed temporarily. Yet people returned because cities were still opportunity centers. This cycle trained resilience mixed with fatalism. Urban water systems failed constantly. Aqueducts broke. Wells ran dry. Contamination spread invisibly. Thirst and disease followed. This shaped rituals around water use and distrust. Even now, urban water scares provoke deep fear rooted in historical memory. Midway through this part, if city life sometimes feels exhausting even without obvious danger, go ahead and like the video. That fatigue isn't modern. Light was limited. Streets were dark at night. Crime thrived. Navigation was dangerous. Torches helped but created fire risk. Cities slept unevenly. Night meant vulnerability. Even today, urban lighting exists to push back this ancient fear. Economic opportunity in cities failed unevenly. Some prospered. Many struggled. Competition was intense. Failure was visible. This created aspiration mixed with resentment. Urban ambition still carries this emotional tension. Smell defined cities. Tanners, butchers, waste, smoke. Odors marked districts. People navigated by smell as much as sight. Modern zoning exists because medieval cities proved mixing everything together didn't work. Rural life failed differently than cities. There were fewer people, more space, and more silence. But failure here unfolded over seasons instead of moments. Agriculture and rural systems were supposed to be stable, predictable, and rooted in cycles. In reality, they were fragile, weather-dependent, and brutally unforgiving. When these products failed, people didn't panic immediately. They waited, hoped, and then starved. Many modern fears around supply, climate, and uncertainty were formed in these long stretches of waiting. Farming tools were the foundation of rural life, and they failed constantly. Plows broke in rocky soil. Wooden parts warped. Iron edges dulled quickly and were difficult to replace. Repairs required skilled labor and materials that weren't always available. A broken plow at the wrong moment could ruin an entire season. This made timing everything. Fields had narrow windows for planting and harvesting. Miss that window and no amount of effort could recover the loss. Modern obsession with scheduling, deadlines, and seasonal planning echoes this agricultural pressure. Soil itself was unreliable. Farmers didn't understand nutrients the way we do now. Fields were exhausted through repeated planting. Yields declined slowly until failure seemed sudden. Crop rotation existed but wasn't always effective or possible. This taught people to accept decline as natural. Hunger didn't always feel like a disaster, felt like a bad year. That normalization of loss shaped endurance rather than prevention. Weather was the greatest uncontrollable failure. Rain came too much or not at all. Frost arrived early. Heat dried crops. Storms flattened fields overnight. There was no insurance, no forecast, no backup. People watched the sky obsessively. Weather wasn't conversation filler. It was survival information. Even today, agricultural anxiety around climate change reflects this inherited vulnerability. Seeds were another fragile product. Poor storage ruined viability. Rodents ate supplies. Mold destroyed reserves. Planting bad seed meant wasted labor and false hope. This created rituals around seed selection and storage. Farmers guarded seed carefully, passing knowledge quietly. Modern seed banking exists because medieval seed failure was devastating. Harvest tools failed too. Sickles broke. Blades cut poorly. Injuries were common. A wounded harvester slowed everyone. Work had to continue despite pain. This normalized working through injury. The idea that rest is optional comes from centuries where stopping meant starvation. Food storage in rural areas failed more slowly but just as completely. Granaries leaked. Moisture caused rot. Insects destroyed reserves quietly over months. Loss was often discovered too late. This taught vigilance. Stores were checked constantly. Small changes mattered. Modern inventory tracking mirrors this habit. Livestock products failed unpredictably. Animals fell ill. Epidemics spread. A dead cow meant lost milk, labor, and fertilizer at once. Recovery took years. People formed emotional bonds with animals because they were partners in survival. Loss felt personal. Even today, farmers grieve livestock losses deeply. Land ownership systems failed unevenly. Tenants depended on landlords. Rents didn't adjust for bad harvests. Debt accumulated. Families were displaced. This created generational insecurity. Even now, rural populations often distrust distant authority because land control once meant survival or ruin. Tools for measuring land and yield failed too. Estimates were rough. Disputes common. Taxes felt arbitrary. People resented systems they couldn't verify. This bred suspicion toward abstract metrics. Trust favored visible effort over recorded numbers. Midway through this part, If long-term uncertainty feels more stressful than immediate crisis, go ahead and like the video. That stress comes from waiting, not chaos. Rural isolation amplified failure. Help was distant. News traveled slowly. One family's loss went unnoticed. Survival depended on mutual aid. Communities shared labor during harvest because individual failure threatened everyone. Cooperation wasn't idealism. It was insurance. Religion and superstition filled gaps. Blessings for fields, rituals for rain, taboos around planting dates. These didn't control weather, but they gave structure to uncertainty. Modern rituals around productivity and planning serve a similar psychological role. Famines rarely began suddenly. They crept in through reduced portions, skipped meals, thinning bodies. People adjusted quietly until they couldn't. This gradual failure shaped emotional restraint. Panic came late. Endurance came early. Children learned agricultural failure young. They watched adults worry silently. This trained emotional control and realism. Even today, people raised around uncertainty often appear calm under pressure because they learned patience early. Before we continue, leave a comment about something in your life that depends on long-term stability rather than quick fixes. And if you want to keep going at this same depth and pace, stay with me. Medieval people didn't experience progress as a smooth climb. New tools and technologies arrived unevenly, often solving one problem while quietly creating 3 new ones. What failed here wasn't just the product, but the expectation that improvement would make life simpler. Many modern frustrations with upgrades, updates, and better systems come directly from these early transitions. Technological change in the medieval world was slow, but when it happened, it was disruptive. New products promised efficiency, safety, or status, but they entered a world built around older habits. That mismatch caused failure, not because the tools were useless, but because people, systems, and environments couldn't absorb them smoothly. Start with mills, one of the most important medieval improvements. Watermills and windmills were revolutionary. They automated labor, saving time and effort. But they were fragile. Water levels changed. Drought stopped mills completely. Floods destroyed them. Gears broke. Wooden teeth wore down quickly. When mills failed, entire communities felt it. Grain couldn't be processed. Food production slowed. People reverted to hand labor reluctantly. Dependency on a single technology created vulnerability. Even today, reliance on centralized systems creates similar fragility when they go offline. Mills also shifted power. Control of milling meant control of food. Lords forced peasants to use specific mills and pay fees. When mills failed, resentment grew. Technology didn't just break physically. It broke social balance. Printing offers another clear example of transitional failure. Early printing promised knowledge spread, but early presses were slow, inconsistent, and expensive. Errors were reproduced rapidly. Misinformation spread alongside learning. Authorities struggled to keep up. Old systems of control over knowledge failed, but new ones weren't ready. This created confusion, fear, and backlash. Modern struggles with information technology echo this first loss of narrative control. Metalworking improvements followed a similar pattern. Better tools existed, but access was uneven. Skilled labor was required to maintain them. A better tool that couldn't be repaired locally became useless quickly. This taught skepticism toward advanced products. Reliability mattered more than novelty. Even now, many people resist upgrades because failure costs feel higher than benefits. Gunpowder weapons illustrate transition failure vividly. Early firearms promised power but delivered unpredictability. They misfired, exploded, terrified users. Reloading was slow. Accuracy was poor. Traditional weapons were reliable by comparison. Mixing old and new technologies created chaos. Training lagged. Doctrine failed. Lives were lost learning what manuals didn't yet exist. This taught caution. New didn't automatically mean better. That instinct still surfaces whenever new tech feels rushed. Timekeeping improvements followed the same arc. Mechanical clocks became more common, but they were inaccurate and required constant adjustment. When they failed, schedules broke down. Expectations rose faster than reliability. This created stress. Precision was demanded before it could be delivered. Even today, time pressure often exceeds actual system accuracy. Navigation technology improved unevenly. Better maps and instruments appeared, but understanding lagged. Misuse caused disaster. Ships trusted tools they didn't fully understand and wrecked. This taught respect for limits. Tools didn't replace judgment. They required it. Modern over-reliance on automation reflects forgetting this lesson. Agricultural improvements failed socially. New plows, crop methods, or enclosures increased efficiency for some and displaced others. Innovation created winners and losers immediately. This bred resistance to change. People weren't anti-progress. They were anti-ruin. Even today, technological disruption carries this same fear. Urban technologies failed at scale. Improved building methods increased density faster than sanitation could adapt. Better transport crowded cities. Systems outpaced support structures. This pattern repeats constantly in history. Growth arrives before stability. Modern urban strain mirrors this mismatch. Midway through this part, if you've ever felt that improvements made life faster but not calmer, go ahead and like the video. That tension is not new. Communication tools improved unevenly. Writing spread faster than literacy. Messages outpaced understanding. Confusion followed. Education couldn't keep up. People encountered ideas they weren't prepared to evaluate. Panic and backlash followed innovation repeatedly. Medical advances often harmed before helping. New treatments spread without understanding. Harm was blamed on patients, not tools. This trained skepticism toward expertise when outcomes didn't match promises. Economic tools improved faster than ethics. New contracts, instruments, and trade systems expanded reach without safeguards. Crashes followed. People learned that complexity increases risk. Simplicity felt safer even when less efficient. Craft specialization increased productivity but reduced resilience. When one trade failed, others suffered. Interdependence amplified failure. This created fragile systems that collapsed under stress. Modern supply chain fragility echoes this medieval lesson. Cultural expectations failed too. Progress promised relief from labor, but workloads often increased. Efficiency benefited owners more than workers. This created disappointment rather than gratitude. Modern burnout reflects this same mismatch between promise and reality. Here we slow down again and look at something medieval people relied on every single day without thinking about it as a product at all: trust systems. Credit, promises, reputation, and informal agreements. These were invisible tools, and when they failed, damage spread quietly and deeply. Many modern anxieties around debt, contracts, and social obligation were shaped here, long before banks or credit scores existed. In the medieval world, most people lived without formal money for much of their lives. Coins existed, but scarcity was common. Trade relied heavily on promises. You borrowed seed, tools, food, labor, protection. You repaid later. This system only worked if trust held. When it failed, everything unraveled. Credit was personal, not institutional. You borrowed from neighbors, merchants, guild members, or landlords. There were no neutral referees. If someone defaulted, it wasn't just financial. It was social. Reputation carried real weight, but it was also fragile and easily manipulated. A bad harvest didn't just mean hunger. It meant unpaid debts, missed obligations, quiet shame. People avoided eye contact in markets. They delayed visits. Failure followed them physically through town. This made debt feel moral, not mathematical. Owing wasn't neutral. It was a reflection of character. That mindset still lingers today when people internalize financial stress as personal failure. Written contracts existed, but literacy was limited. Many agreements were oral. Memory mattered. Witnesses mattered. Disputes arose constantly because recollections differed. Power decided whose memory became truth. This made promises risky. People learned to underpromise and overdeliver when possible. Even today, cautious communication around obligation reflects this survival instinct. Merchants faced constant failure in trust systems. Goods were damaged, stolen, or delayed. Partners disappeared. Markets fluctuated unpredictably. Losses cascaded quickly because margins were thin. To cope, merchants spread risk socially. They partnered, diversified routes, relied on family networks. Modern business networks mirror this medieval risk distribution strategy. Guilds emerged partly to stabilize trust. Membership signaled reliability. Rules enforced behavior internally. But guilds also failed. Corruption crept in. Nepotism thrived. Outsiders were excluded unfairly. Trust became closed rather than open. Innovation slowed. Protection turned into restriction. Modern professional gatekeeping echoes this pattern. Landlords and tenants lived inside unstable trust loops. Tenants promised rent. Landlords promised protection. When either failed, retaliation followed. Evictions were brutal. Resistance was punished. This normalized fear-based compliance. People followed rules not because they trusted authority, but because consequences were severe. Religious trust systems failed differently. Tithes were expected. Charity was promised. Sometimes it arrived. Often it didn't. Faith was tested materially. People learned to separate belief from expectation. Spiritual trust didn't guarantee practical support. That separation still exists. Dowries, marriages, and inheritance were trust contracts too. Promises were broken. Payments delayed. Families feuded for generations over unmet obligations. This made family alliances tense rather than comforting. Even today, money entangles family relationships painfully. Markets relied on trust in weights, measures, and honesty. Fraud thrived where enforcement was weak. Buyers became cautious, sellers defensive. This slowed trade and increased suspicion. Modern consumer protections exist because medieval ones failed. News itself was a trust product. Rumors spread faster than verification. Panic followed misinformation. Prices spiked. Violence erupted. People learned to distrust second-hand information, yet had no alternative. This tension between skepticism and dependence still defines information consumption. Midway through this part, if money stress feels emotional rather than logical, go ahead and like the video. That emotional weight comes from centuries of moralized debt. Hospitality was another fragile trust system. Travelers depended on strangers. Inns cheated. Hosts betrayed guests. Guests stole. Customs existed, but enforcement varied. Travel carried constant risk. Modern expectations of standardized service come from this instability. Even friendship functioned as a support product. Friends shared resources in crisis. When they couldn't, relationships fractured. This made people cautious about closeness. Dependence carried risk. Promises from authority failed routinely. Tax relief promised after disasters didn't arrive. Protection guarantees broke under pressure. This bred deep skepticism toward official assurances. Modern distrust of vague promises has medieval roots. Now talks about education, knowledge, and learning systems in the medieval world. These were supposed to preserve wisdom, pass skills forward, and reduce failure over time. Instead, they often became gatekeepers, bottlenecks, and distortion machines. Many modern frustrations with education, expertise, and knowing better but still failing were shaped right here. In the medieval world, knowledge was one of the most unevenly distributed products of all. Information existed, but access did not. Skill existed, but transfer was fragile. Learning systems failed not because people were unintelligent, but because the structures around learning were narrow, slow, and exclusionary. Start with literacy. Reading and writing were rare skills. Most people lived their entire lives unable to read contracts, laws, religious texts, or instructions. Knowledge existed in written form, but it might as well have been locked away. This created dependence. People relied on priests, scribes, officials, or elders to interpret the world for them. When those intermediaries failed, intentionally or not, misunderstanding spread. Even today, people often depend on experts without the tools to verify what they're told. Education was not designed for everyone. It was designed for clergy, administrators, and elites. Schools existed, but they served narrow purposes. Learning focused on memorization, doctrine, and obedience rather than problem solving. This limited adaptability. When conditions changed, educated systems responded slowly. Knowledge preserved the past better than it prepared for the future. Apprenticeship systems were practical but fragile. Skills were passed from master to apprentice over years. Quality depended entirely on the master. Some taught patiently. Others exploited labor and withheld knowledge. If a master died, disappeared, or failed, years of learning vanished. Skills were not standardized. Techniques varied widely. Consistency suffered. This taught people to guard knowledge jealously. Teaching someone everything meant creating competition. Even today, knowledge hoarding persists in workplaces for this reason. Universities began to appear, but they failed many people. Instruction was theoretical, disconnected from daily life. Language barriers excluded most. Latin dominated learning while common people spoke local tongues. This split knowledge into official and practical. Farmers, builders, healers knew things universities ignored. That divide still exists between academic and lived knowledge. Medical education failed spectacularly. Texts were copied inaccurately. Ancient authorities were revered over observation. Bad information was preserved faithfully. When treatments failed, blame fell on patients or fate, not theory. This delayed improvement. Even today, systems struggle to admit foundational error. Religious education shaped worldview deeply. Scripture interpretation varied, but questioning authority was dangerous. Doubt carried risk. This trained intellectual caution. People learned to survive by appearing compliant. Genuine curiosity moved underground. Modern fear of speaking openly about beliefs echoes this constraint. Books themselves were fragile products. Hand-copied manuscripts contained errors. Pages were lost. Meanings shifted subtly over generations. Knowledge degraded slowly, invisibly. People trusted texts without knowing how much had changed. Modern misinformation spreads faster, but the problem isn't new. Oral tradition filled gaps, but it failed differently. Stories changed with retelling. Practical instructions drifted. Memory failed under stress. This created variation. Some communities thrived on accurate tradition. Others suffered from accumulated error. Education for women was especially limited. Skills were learned informally. Knowledge passed through observation rather than instruction. This made expertise invisible. Women knew much, but systems didn't recognize it. Even today, uncredited labor often hides deep skill. Children learned by doing, not studying. Mistakes were costly. Learning curves were steep and unforgiving. This created competence early, but also trauma. Failure wasn't abstract. It hurt. Modern fear of making mistakes reflects this legacy. Language itself was unstable. Dialects varied widely. Misunderstandings were common. Instructions failed across regions. Standardization came slowly. Until then, knowledge traveled poorly. Even today, communication gaps persist across cultures. Midway through this part, if you've ever felt that school didn't teach you what you actually needed later in life, go ahead and like the video. That gap has a long history. Maps and diagrams failed often. They simplified complex realities poorly. Users trusted them anyway. This taught skepticism toward representations. Reality didn't match diagrams. Judgment mattered. Teaching authority failed when teachers couldn't explain why something worked. Rules were memorized without understanding. This created brittle knowledge. When conditions changed, learning collapsed. Libraries existed, but access was restricted. Knowledge accumulated behind walls. Fire, war, and neglect destroyed collections easily. Entire fields vanished overnight. Progress wasn't guaranteed. Even today, data loss remains terrifying. Education reinforced hierarchy. Knowing certain things granted power. Ignorance maintained control. This linked learning with authority rather than curiosity. Modern credentialism echoes this structure. By the end of the medieval period, people didn't sit down and reflect on how many systems had failed them. They didn't name patterns or write think pieces about it. They simply carried the lessons forward in their behavior. That's how most history actually survives. Not as records, but as instincts. And that's where all of these failed medieval products quietly live today, inside habits we rarely question. Memory itself became the final product medieval society relied on, and it was shaped by everything that had gone wrong before. People remembered what not to trust. They remembered which promises collapsed, which tools broke at the worst moment, which systems demanded obedience without offering protection in return. These memories didn't stay neatly in the past. They hardened into caution. By the time later generations inherited the world, they didn't need to experience the original failures directly. The responses were already built in. Distrust of authority, suspicion of perfect solutions, preference for redundancy, emotional reactions to scarcity, debt, and instability that feel larger than the present moment requires. Take preparedness. Medieval people learned that systems fail quietly first. Food rots before famine is declared. Trust erodes before betrayal becomes obvious. Tools weaken before they snap. That's why stockpiling, backups, and contingency planning feel reassuring even in stable times. It isn't paranoia. It's inherited memory. Take work culture. Centuries of failed labor-saving products taught people that efficiency rarely benefits workers first. Promises of relief often led to higher expectations, tighter schedules, and more pressure. That's why burnout doesn't feel like personal weakness. It feels structural, because it is. Take relationships with authority. Medieval governments, courts, churches, and lords all promised order and protection. Sometimes they delivered, often they didn't. People learned to comply publicly and hedge privately. Even today, many follow rules while quietly planning around them. That dual mindset wasn't rebellion. It was survival. Take education and expertise. Knowledge once failed to reach the people who needed it most. When it did arrive, it was often distorted, delayed, or locked behind status. That's why modern skepticism toward experts can coexist with deep dependence on them. Trust was never simple. It was conditional. Take cities and infrastructure. Medieval urban life taught people that density magnifies failure. When water systems break, when food stops moving, when waste accumulates, collapse accelerates. That's why modern urban crises trigger outsized fear. People sense how quickly systems can unravel, even if they can't explain why. Take technology itself. Medieval transitions taught people that new tools arrive before wisdom catches up, that upgrades introduce unfamiliar risks, that convenience can hide fragility, that instinctive pause before embracing something new isn't backwardness. It's memory speaking. None of these lessons were written into law. They were written into behavior, past parent to child, community to community, generation to generation. They survived because they worked. And that's the quiet irony of medieval product failure. Even when tools, systems, and ideas collapsed, people adapted. They didn't wait for perfect solutions. They learned to live inside imperfection. They learned to watch for cracks, to rely on people more than promises, to expect disruption, to prepare emotionally for loss, to continue anyway. Those habits didn't disappear with the Middle Ages. They followed us into modern life, shaping how we respond to stress, change, and uncertainty. That low-level tension many people feel today, even in comfort, isn't new. It's old, very old. We don't live in castles or plague cities anymore, but we still flinch at scarcity. We still mistrust systems that claim to be flawless. We still feel unease when everything depends on one point of failure. That isn't weakness. It's historical intelligence. So when something modern breaks, and your reaction feels stronger than the situation alone seems to justify, remember this: you're not overreacting. You're reacting with centuries of inherited experience. You're carrying lessons learned the hard way by people who didn't have the luxury of optimism. And that's why these medieval failures still matter. Not because we want to go back, but because they explain why we feel the way we do right now. If this story changed the way you see modern systems, even a little, let me know in the comments. I genuinely read them, and they help guide what stories come next. If you listen complete story, go ahead and tap like. It tells the algorithm this kind of slow, thoughtful history is worth sharing. And if you want more long-form stories that connect the past to the instincts we live with today, subscribe. This channel exists for people who like history that doesn't shout, doesn't rush, and doesn't treat the past like a museum display. Thanks for staying until the end. This wasn't just medieval history, it was a mirror, and I'll see you in the next one.